Well, that was very sobering. And I have to say I'm a little disappointed. When Senator McCain offered to produce this year's videos, he swore to us that they would be fair and balanced. But I guess he was using the Fox News definition of the term, and we should have known better. This is also a little awkward because
fair and balanced.
If you'll notice, the title of the panel doesn't specify which superpower we're here to discuss. So I had produced a long list of questions on Canada's rising hegemony, given the venue. And you know, if you want to focus on that, I think this audience would be amenable. After all, Canada's got the oil, it's got the water, it's got the lobsters, it's got the Ford brothers, it's got a prime minister who's willing to tell Vladimir Putin to go to hell. But I suppose given your positions, we should stick to the US. So let me start this properly. I'm Jonathan Tepperman. I'm the managing editor of Foreign Affairs magazine. It's a huge honor for me to be sharing the stage with two Borscht Belt comedians, I mean statesmen of the calibers of Senators McCain and Tim Kaine. We're thrilled to have them and all the other members of the congressional delegation here this year. And we thank you so much for your participation. Now, I usually kick off these panels by making a jokey introduction of the speakers. But since you all know the senators already, and since I'm slightly frightened of Senator McCain, I'm going to skip the preambles and dive right in. This is now the third time that I've moderated a panel at Halifax on the United States and its global role. But this is the first time that there's been so much uncertainty in the zeitgeist, in the global conversation about the premise of the panel itself. Given all the popular media hand-wringing and teeth-gnashing about American decline in the last year, we could easily spend this entire session just debating the 13 words in the panel's headline. Is the United States still the exceptional superpower? Does it still have an indispensable role? In the last year, the debate over these issues have tended to fix on one of two storylines. The first holds that the many crises of 2014, this year that President Ilves referred to last night accurately, I think, as an annus horribilis, crises from Ukraine to ISIS to Ebola represent abject failures of US leadership. But the second line, the counter-argument, argues that Washington now faces an unprecedentedly difficult global environment, or at least the hardest in a generation. And given that, we should cut US leadership and the president some slack for doing its best under these very trying conditions, for attempting to hit singles and doubles in the president's word. That's a baseball metaphor for those of you who don't come from North America, and I can't convert it to cricket, I apologize. Under this theory, we would give the president credit for example, despite the fact that he just got shellacked in the midterms, he then went off to Asia and came back with a significant new climate deal with China and made progress on trade negotiations. Now, because I don't want this panel purely to become a debate about the president, although I'm sure his name will come up more than once, I'd like to focus my first question for you gentlemen on that difficult global environment and the fear that the US has indeed lost its preeminence. Now, because you're both smart politicians, I suspect that neither of you will agree with the argument that the US is no longer an exceptional superpower. And I'm not sure that I buy it either, frankly. But what I do want to ask instead is, given the recent trends and events, which I've alluded to and you're all very aware of, from, and let's add in America's institutional decay, the public's war weariness, the American public's war weariness, and declining support for international ventures of all sorts, the rise of China and other emerging nations, the rise of powerful and threatening non-state actors, of which we've heard a lot already today, the growing belligerence of declining nations like Russia, Europe's never-ending struggles, and the shrinking relevance of international bodies like the UN, the G20, et cetera. The question is, do you think all of these conditions have changed what it means to be the world's sole superpower, and have changed what America's role should be? Senator McCain.
Well, first of all, I'd like to recall in the beginning of 2009, at the beginning of the Obama presidency, and look at the world then, and now look at the world today. And I don't believe that the deterioration of American leadership and position in the world and many of the aspects of the Arab Spring, Putin's aggressive behavior, I don't think they're like hurricanes or earthquakes. I don't think things happen by accident in world affairs. I think they have to do with perceptions. I think they have to do with reality. And by the way, before we go much further, I'm very optimistic about the future of the United States of America. We're going to be energy independent. Manufacturing jobs are coming home. We are seeing a steady improvement in our economy. There's a lot of good things that are happening in America. But on the issue of national security, during the Cold War, we were always, and the scenario of a nuclear exchange was always there, so we were always in great danger. But I have never seen the world in greater disarray and a failure of American leadership throughout. I just saw a picture up there of Ukraine. You know, one of the most astounding things to me is why we will not give defensive weapons to the Ukrainians while their country is being dismembered. How in God's name do you justify something like that? How do you do that? I was at the Maidan. I saw 300,000 people in sub-freezing weather demonstrating because they want to be free of exactly what's happening to them now. Their country is being dismembered. Does anybody ever mention the shoot down of an airliner? Does anybody ever mention the fact, the first time since the end of World War II, we're watching a European country being dismembered? And what are we doing? We're bragging about the fact we're giving them blankets. I've found in my lifetime that blankets don't do very well against tanks. And so we have now an increased Russian military presence in Ukraine. And I guarantee you, Colonel Vladimir Putin is figuring out what the cost-benefit ratio is to moving forward all the way across southern Ukraine to Moldova. And right now he is pressuring, the president of Estonia is here amongst us. He'll tell you the pressure that is being put on the Baltic countries. So we'll talk about the Middle East, I'm sure, but is there ever a more clear-cut case where people who want to be part of the European community, who are tired of Yanukovych and his corruption and his cronyism and his kleptocracy, that we won't even, I think the reason why I mention that, it's symbolic of not only a failure of American leadership, but a failure of everything the United States has ever stood for in my entire life, and that is help people who are struggling to be free. And so I will stop there, except to say that if there is a symptom of a failure of American leadership, it exists in Ukraine today, as our NATO commander, General Breedlove, tells us that there are more Russian tanks pouring in to eastern Ukraine. And we lost 4,000 brave Americans in our struggle in Iraq, which I'm sure we'll talk about later on. The Ukrainians have already lost 4,000 dead. 4,000 dead soldiers. And what's our response? We're going to send them more blankets. Well, that to me, history will judge not a lot of things, but the Ukrainian situation extremely harshly. And it reminds me a little bit, my dear friends, of the 1930s when German-speaking people had to be liberated. And it is scary.
Senator Kaine, I'm going to try to see if I can get you to avoid taking that bait for a second. and speak first to the general question, given what's changed in the world in the last decade and then in the last year, has the definition, has the meaning of the role of a global superpower, and given the changes in the United States, has the American role by necessity changed?
You can try to keep me from taking the bait, but you will not be successful. And I do want to get to that question, but let me just jump in. I want to puncture the bubble of American decline. And I'm going to just do this for a couple of minutes because I feel very strongly about it. And in this sense, we're both optimists about the future, but let me just get into it. Economically, the IMF met a couple months ago and said 2 of the world's economies have done the best job of climbing out of the worst recession since the 1930s. Ours was one. Jobs, longest stretch of private sector job growth in the history of the nation. Dow Jones closed at a record yesterday. And because of our innovation economy, we've gone from importer to exporter, largest energy producer in the world, while we've reduced greenhouse gas emissions. Military. We left Iraq because they wanted to kick us out. They begged us to come back. The Afghanis have kept us in, and as a result, their life expectancy has gone from 44 years old to 61 years old in the last decade, unprecedented in human history. We're leading the fight with so many other great allies like Canada against ISIL. We've destroyed one of the largest chemical weapons stockpiles in the world in the last year. We're around the world engaging in counterterrorism operations and training foreign militaries on every continent. We have a talent strategy second to none with universities that people are still banging the door down to get in from all over the world, and an immigration policy that enhances our talent. On trade, we're working at the key to make key trade deals. We protect the sea lanes of the world, and we're the key actor in so many of the international institutions that protect trade. Diplomacy. These are big, hard things, but a negotiation over an Iranian nuclear program, an attempt to find a better government in Iraq, an attempt to find a coalition government that would work in Afghanistan, these are happening because of the United States. We're projecting our values, religious tolerance, press freedom, gender equality, equality for folks regardless of sexual orientation in ways that are affecting the rest of the world. When there's a humanitarian crisis like Ebola, we all work together, but it's U.S. soldiers and personnel that are over in Africa trying to fight it off. People want us. And finally, and this is the big one, and I have a visual I want to put up, if somebody could put up my visual for me. Magnanimity. Go back to Aristotle. The pinnacle character virtue of a person or of a society is magnanimity. It's a hard concept to understand. April of 2014 in Da Nang Harbor, that is my visual, the USS John S. McCain in Da Nang Harbor, Vietnam. I think it would be hard to imagine another nation in the world. This guy stands for magnanimity, courage, grace, grace in victory, willingness to work together with somebody who was an enemy yesterday. But this picture isn't just about this guy. This is a picture about who America is today. We ended a war that was a desultory and difficult one with Vietnam when I was a kid. It was one of the formative experiences of my life. And now here we are, the U.S. John McCain, POW in a Vietnamese prisoner of war camp, ship named after him, being greeted with honors by the Vietnamese Navy in Da Nang this year. And they've invited that ship back. Whether it was our role in rebuilding Germany, our role in rebuilding Japan, the relation we have with Vietnam now, which was because of Senator McCain. He and Senator Kerry said we need to figure out a path forward. And although we've got all kinds of issues with Vietnam still, and Senator McCain is tough on him on human rights issues, we have built a relationship of magnanimity that characterizes who we are as people. Not holding a grudge, not living in the past, willing to extend a hand and figure out a way to work. I'm a Virginian, so I'm really focused on 150th anniversary of the end of the Civil War, Appomattox in April. When the news of that was announced and people gathered outside the White House like they did after bin Laden was killed, and they all cheered, and Lincoln came out on the porch and talked to him for a minute, and then he said, you know what, to the band there, why don't you play Dixie? I've always really liked that song. That's who we are as a people, with malice toward none, with charity to all, and we're still that way today, and that's what that picture shows. We got problems, we got challenges. He's right about the Ukraine. But let's not take for granted all this great stuff that we are doing today that the world needs us doing, that we are doing, and then just focus on the areas where we're not doing well, as if that's the whole picture. Because I think the whole picture still has us in a pretty darn good place.
So, Senator, can I read from your comments that you feel that you buy the argument that the president is playing this bad hand that he's been dealt pretty well?
Look, I think there's some areas where he's playing it really well, because if you'd put that video together and spliced in him talking about the death of bin Laden, or spliced in him talking about all kinds of other things, the video would have looked a lot different. So there's many aspects of this that he's playing well, but there are aspects where I don't think he's playing it that well. Hey, he's a human being. He's a president of the United States. We don't put him on a pedestal. They all come with imperfections, and they all make mistakes. And I think we are. Look, I think the biggest mistake in American government right now is the Article 1 branch. I meet people every day who like or don't like the president. They don't tell me the presidency's broken. I meet people every day who like or don't like the Roberts Court. They don't tell me that the Article 3 branch of the judiciary is broken. But I meet people every day, Democratic, Republican, and Independent, who tell me they think the Article 1 branch is broken. And look, I own part of that. I'm part of the branch. So I do think there's some institutional challenges, some things the president has done wrong, congressional dysfunction, Senate can't get a budget for 4 years, haven't had a true budget deal in a bipartisan Congress since 1986. I think there's some challenges. But what I don't believe is that while the challenges are changing and the leadership role we have is changing, and I'll get into this later, but I agree with two of the three words, operative words in your title, which are superpower and, superpower and exceptional. But the word I want to replace out of the lexicon is indispensable. De Gaulle said the graveyards are filled with indispensable men. There was an isolationist period for America, then there was an indispensable period, but indispensability always carries within it a hubris that can be a problem. I want to replace indispensable with exemplary. We should try to be the exemplary nation, an exemplary nation. And if we are, we're much more likely to be indispensable. But if you try to be the indispensable nation, you're much more likely to blunder into situations where maybe others are better suited, or coalitions are better suited, or maybe you shouldn't be there at all. Let's be exemplary.
Senator McCain, I want to return to your criticisms of current policy, which are very well taken. As you know, criticizing is easier than problem solving. So let's say that things had gone differently in 2008 and you had chosen a different running mate and were President of the United States now. Given the very real... I thought I could just slip that in and no one would notice. Given the very real constraints that any American president would face right now, including a public that seems to be demonstrating that it has no interest in enhanced international engagement, what would you be doing differently, and how would you deal with those obstacles specifically?
Well, first of all, let's talk about this, how war-weary Americans are, okay? And how war-weary, and we don't want to have anything to do with the world. Well, we were war-weary after World War II when Harry Truman decided to make the decisions that he made, which affected the entire war. We stayed in Korea when it was highly unpopular. Think of the world today if Korea had fallen to the North Koreans and the Chinese. After Vietnam, we were war-weary, and Ronald Reagan came to the presidency. Look, it's all about leadership. It's all about presidents that can talk to the American people and explain to them the challenges that we face. Is there anyone here who doesn't believe that Mr. Baghdadi's ultimate goal is to destroy America? When he left Camp Bucca after spending 4 years there, and he said, "I'll see you in New York." So I really get sometimes weary of this statement. So we're war weary, so let's leave the world and see what happens. And that's basically what we've done. And I'll tell you what's happened. There's been a vacuum of American leadership. And so we have seen a situation, and this is where Tim and I have we have a number of disagreements, and I have the highest respect and regard for him, and that's about what happened in Iraq. Thank God for General Petraeus. Thank God for the President of the United States firing his Secretary of Defense, which I had called for. Remember when I was calling for this, firing the Secretary of Defense and changing the surge and criticizing President Bush? I was the brave maverick. You remember that? And now when I criticize President Obama, it's the cranky old man. You know, that's it. It's always interesting to see that comparison there. We all knew that the surge had succeeded at the enormous cost of American blood and treasure, and it was under control. You can look at the casualties, you can look at the number of attacks, you can look at every indicator.
Very true.
And we had it under control, but we had to leave a force behind. Now, we'll go back and forth on this, but Secretary Gates, Secretary Panetta, and our most respected Ambassador Ryan Crocker, all three have said unequivocally we could have, if we had worked it the right way, left a force behind. Did the President of the United States ever say once he wanted to leave a force behind? Does anybody know of that? Of course not. When the last one left, didn't he go immediately on television and say, "Hey, the last American troop has left Iraq"? My friends, that's a failure of leadership and a failure to recognize. Look, I was campaigning for our Senate candidates, and some of them won in spite of my presence. And I was at a veterans event. A young man came up to me and said, "Senator McCain, I was at the Second Battle of Fallujah. At the Second Battle of Fallujah, the bloodiest conflict of the whole Iraq conflict, we lost 86 soldiers and Marines, 400 wounded." He said, 3 of my platoon mates were killed. He said, "Now the black flags of ISIS fly over Fallujah. Tell me, Senator McCain, what do I tell their mothers?" I haven't got an answer for it, but I guarantee you that if we'd have left a sustainable force behind, that the situation would be different. And I'll tell you again what I've been saying ever since the President announced it. Unless we leave a sustaining force behind in Afghanistan, we're going to see the same movie. And that's really watching, it's like watching a train wreck, as we did in Iraq. I'm watching the same train wreck about to take place in Afghanistan, and we've lost too much brave young Americans and American treasure to see this absolute misperception of the nature of the enemy. Finally, just as far as ISIS is concerned, this is the same outfit that your visionary president called the JV, the junior varsity. Remember that? That was the junior varsity ISIS. Lindsey Graham and I, it's in the Wall Street Journal, we said, watch out for this ISIS. They are on the rise. They're going to destabilize the entire region, especially if we... So it's not that we didn't predict these things. In fact, we predicted every one of them because common sense and knowledge were clearly indicated the debacle we're in today. Now there's 200,000 dead in Syria. Now we have an outfit that controls an area as big as the state of Indiana that announced that enslavement of women is in keeping with Sharia law. Now, and they are dedicated to the proposition of destroying us. I'll stop there. But if that's a record of accomplishment that we can be proud of, I can assure you that view is not shared by any country in the entire Middle East, because the Syria decision on chemical weapons was a seminal moment, and you can ask any leader in the Middle East. They don't trust us.
Senator Kaine, I want to ask you about ISIL in Iraq and leadership today. You've forcefully argued that the president should go to Congress to get specific authorization for the war. And you've said that a major mission like this requires, quote, a political consensus behind it. But how can a president build such a consensus in a Congress which is as polarized as the institution is today? And is it fair to hold major, in fact, critical foreign policy initiatives hostage to what will be inevitable party squabbles?
You've got to hold the decision to go to war hostage to the dysfunctions of Congress, because you just can't have a war without Congress. I mean, you just can't. Constitutionally, a president can defend the nation against imminent threat without Congress. Presidents can do that and need to immediately. But once we go beyond the imminent threat of defense into, as the president says, going on offense against ISIL, we need to have a war against ISIL, you've got to have Congress on board. Senator McCain and I are working together on this. We look at it the same way. Constitutionally, you need it. The real reason you need it is you can't ask people to risk their lives, risk getting killed, seeing other folks getting killed or injured, if Congress isn't willing to do the job to put their thumbprint on and say this is a national mission that's worth it. What we've devolved to is executive overreach and legislative abdication on matters of war, where we put people's lives at risk without us doing the job that we need to do to say this mission is worth it. If we say the mission is worth it, then we can ask people to sacrifice. But if we're not willing to have the debate and say the mission is worth it, it's immoral to ask people to sacrifice. We've already had our first combat death in the war against ISIL. A Marine Corporal, Jordan Spears from Indiana, was killed on the 2nd of October. We had another a death in a non-combat circumstance of somebody who had been deployed there for the war against ISIL. So we need to do our jobs. And look, I fault the president. He should have brought us an authorization. When he gave that speech on the 10th of September about here is what we need to do, 4-point plan, humanitarian relief, that's not complicated, counterterrorism operations, arm and equip moderates, airstrike campaigns. He should have brought an authorization to us and led us on foreign relations debate, and we would have edited it, we would have revised it. We should have been doing it right then. We shouldn't have adjourned for 7 weeks before a midterm election with a war going on and no vote. And now we're hearing that we may not get to a vote until January. That will then have been 4 or 5 months of unilateral presidential military action without Congress saying a mumbling word about this. It's ridiculous. So now, the fact that the president has not done what I think he should do does not excuse the Article I branch from not doing what we need to do. And again, Senator McCain and I are right on the same page on this one. We've been trying to get our colleagues to do it, and it's still my hope that we're going to do something, even in the lame duck on it. But the good news is on this one, you'll get Congress. If the president had asked us to vote on September, he would have had the votes. Some issues are hard. ISIL as a threat to the United States is not a hard issue, even in a dysfunctional Congress.
Could I just say I totally agree with Tim, and I do think that it was very important for the president to come over with the authorization that he wants, and that hasn't happened. Every time I've been involved in these, and several authorizations, Bosnia, Desert Storm, et cetera, they've come over with their outline, and then we've debated and amended, and that hasn't happened. And you know, unfortunately, technically now, we are in violation of the War Powers Act. Mm-hmm. And that's not good for Congress. It's not good for the president for us to act in a manner which is in violation of laws that the Congress passed and was signed by the president. So we need to get on this AUMF. I'm concerned about too many curbs, frankly, on the president's authority and what he's able to do, because I believe that we can't be constrained by situations on the battlefield that we can't predict. But we really need to do it, and I think the American people really want it to happen. Could I, by the way, the picture of the ship is named after my father and grandfather, not after me.
Understood.
Well, usually you have to die before a ship is named after you. And I know that's, some can hardly wait. A ship named after me.
On that note, let's open things up to the audience. Questions, please. The lady in the white scarf. Just wait for the microphone, please.
Thank you so much. Scotty Greenwood from, I work in Washington, but as the senator knows, I live in Virginia. A topic that all three of you mentioned briefly, but I'd love for you to talk about a little more about American power, is our role in energy. And energy is a global geopolitical issue. As I think everybody knows, there's a crude oil export ban that's been around since the 70s. The president has the authority to lift it, I think. Congress could also do something about that. There are several pipeline projects that we're all interested in, one in particular. I think you guys disagree about that one. But that's been around, KXL's been around 6 years, so we're going to get a resolution of that. And then thirdly, LNG exports. How do you feel about the future of that, and how all of those things could affect the world order? Thanks.
Thank you. So the U.S. is becoming an energy superpower. Yeah. How do we start acting like one?
Well, I would like to see the XL pipeline, and you're all aware of that. I think sooner or later it's going to happen. But that's not the major part of it. It's very important, but we need permission for more ports to be built. We need to probably have more or settle some of the environmental problems around some of these areas where the energy is. But there's a lot of aspects of this, but the most important aspect of it is eliminating our dependence upon the energy from the Middle East. That has to change dramatically, all to our benefit, where our national security priorities lie. And that doesn't mean I'm advocating abandoning the Middle East or anything else, but it certainly gives us a latitude that we would never have otherwise. And on that subject, and I say with all due respect to my European friends, they have done nothing really significant in the way of actions against Putin's aggression, and they won't as long as they're dependent on Russian energy.
Mm-hmm. And just real quick, so on the three, I voted against Keystone this week, as many of you know. Pipelines are fine, but I'm not a tar sands guy. My energy thought is cleaner tomorrow than today. And I've just been worried about accelerated tar sands development is countering it. And that is a controversial view, but one that I hold. However, on exports of crude, I'm for it. Exports of LNG, think it makes sense. There's probably three camps in Congress on the export of LNG. There's the no never. There is the treat it like it was a pencil, export it wherever you can get the best price. And there's kind of a middle group that I'm in, which is, yeah, definitely export for national security purposes. If we can help European nations wean themselves away from over-reliance on Russia, that's great. If we can help India and Japan back off a little bit some of the purchases of Iranian oil, now they've already backed off a bit. If we can do more, that would be great. So now John Barrasso has really been a leader on this one in the Senate. Strategic exports of LNG make perfect sense. We haven't yet even fully grasped the game-changing nature of this energy revolution in North America in terms of not only changing our economies, our trade deficits, but also changing the geopolitical reality, not just in the Middle East, but in other relationships. And it is going to be a real source of power for Canada, the United States, and Mexico, frankly, in a way that's going to do a lot of good.
Senator Kaine,
Could I just say as a footnote, I still believe in nuclear power, and now with our majority, we may be able to reinvigorate Yucca Mountain and maybe press forward more vigorously with nuclear power, nuclear energy. I think it's safe, and certainly we sail Navy ships around the world with nuclear power plants on them. So I think that's also one of the things we need.
Virginia is 40% nuclear power, and it's worked very, very well for us.
Since we're in Canada, I have to press you on your Keystone vote, if I can. The oil is going to come out of the tar sands whether Keystone gets built or not. It seems to me the question is how it gets transported via freight trains, which burn more hydrocarbons, or via pipelines, which are, in a sense, greener. So why oppose the pipeline?
Sure.
That's an excellent question. Really well done.
Now, where is and where is the cabinet minister who was planted next to me at dinner last night, Stephen, who was making this argument for 3.5 hours? So here he is. Okay. All right. Did you hear this? Accepting that that's true, that it's going to come out of the ground anyway. I think there's some aspects of global pricing, et cetera, that put some question in that. But accepting that that's true, there is a finite amount of carbon emissions in this tar sands oil that by virtually any measure is conventionally dirtier than petroleum. There is a finite amount of carbon emissions. The slower that comes out of the ground, the better for the environment. The faster the carbon is emitted into the atmosphere, the worse for the environment. So if the goal is to get it out of the ground as fast as we can, to make as much money as we can, you're going to emit the carbon a lot faster, it's going to be worse for the environment. If, on the other hand, a more reasonable approach, in my view, is to take a position, look, that the U.S., with everything we're doing right, the switching to natural gas, utility-grade solar has gone up by 23 times in the last decade. The fastest growing source of power in the United States is wind power, the natural gas revolution. We've got better options that are fine energy and cleaner. I want to power down that road. If no Keystone pipeline means it still comes out of the ground, but it comes out of the ground slower, that means slower CO2 emissions, and that's good for the environment. And I'll tell you, this isn't theoretical to me. Hampton Roads, Virginia is 1.6 million people. It is the second most vulnerable community in the United States to sea level rise. It's like Halifax. It's the center of naval power for our country, the largest center of naval power in the world. In Hampton Roads right now, the flooding at normal tides is dramatically different than it has been even 10 years ago. There's neighborhoods where you can't even sell your homes. The main road in and out of our Navy base by 2040 under just regular projections is going to be underwater 3 hours every day without even taking into account storm effects. This is having a dramatic effect on my community, second largest in my state right now. It's not a tomorrow issue, it's a today issue. And I'm not going to take a bunch of steps that tell my 1.6 million people in the center of naval power in the world, hey, sorry, because everybody says that sea level rise is caused partly by escalating carbon emissions. So we got to start somewhere. If you don't say no to something, and if I really think we've got two choices. Is the policy anything goes, or is the policy cleaner tomorrow than today? And I have adopted, I think it should be cleaner tomorrow than today. Even if the tar sands oil comes out of the ground, if it comes out of the ground over 50 years instead of over 25, that will be a positive in terms of net CO2 emissions, and that's why I voted the way I did.
Well, we have a lot of Albertans in the House this weekend. The Senator will be here until Sunday. If you come up to me afterwards, I can give you his room number, and we can continue the conversation that way. The gentleman in the third row, please.
I'm Admiral retired Nirmal Varma, a former Chief of Indian Navy. I find over the last day or so that we've been discussing various things. One hotspot which has scarcely found mention has been South China Sea. I'd like to ask the panel that do you see the need for drawing red lines over South China Sea, and what would the contours be for it?
First of all, I congratulate the Indian people on their election and selection of Mr. Modi, who I think is going to be one of the great leaders in the world, and I think it bodes well for U.S.-India relations, and that we have a lot of work to do, including in the Asia-Pacific region. I don't know if the word is red line, because that could lead to an international crisis that I'm not exactly sure we have enough allies and enough consensus as how to handle. But I don't think there's any doubt that the Chinese behavior, you know, it's funny, there's about 10 different names for the South China Sea. It depends on what country you are from, but I think it's very dangerous. I think that brinksmanship. I think the Chinese have alienated other countries in the region in a way that does not show the kind of patience and foresight that we always give them credit for. Mm-hmm. And it's also reshaping the entire region as far as alliances is concerned because of their behavior. So I don't know if the answer is a red line or not, but I do believe that ASEAN and even other alliances can try to send the message to the Chinese that this is not the appropriate behavior. Finally, I don't think there's any doubt of what the Chinese ambitions are. It's to fulfill the age-old, thousands-year-old role that they play in that part of the world. And I think it's getting more and more dangerous all the time.
Admiral Verma, I'm worried about red lines too, but I'll tell you this. The U.S.-Indian naval cooperation and the cooperation of the Indian Navy with other navies is dramatically on the uptick. India now performs more joint military exercises with the United States than any other nation. I just toured the Magazine docks in Mumbai, where are built surface ships and subs, and it is very impressive. And I think more joint exercises. The Indians joined in the RIMPAC exercise this year. Trilateral exercises between the U.S., India, and Japan are now taking place. All of those things, I think, can be a projection, a positive projection before you even get to the red line question, and we need to do more of it.
The lady in the back, please.
Mary Fitzgerald, Libya-based journalist and analyst. A question for Senator McCain. Senator McCain, I know you've spent some time in Libya since 2011, and I find it extraordinary the extent to which Libya has been overlooked at some of the discussions we've had at Halifax so far. For those who haven't been paying attention, in recent months, Libya has seen a deepening of its political and security vacuum. Just last week, Baghdadi confirmed that ISIS has now got a presence in eastern Libya. We're talking about a country on the shores of southern Europe where the channels coming from the Sahel, porous borders. It's a very, very toxic mix. My question to you, Senator McCain, is what should be done about the situation in Libya right now? What can be done? And are we likely to see another Western-led intervention in Libya? Because that's what many Libyans are actually calling for right now.
Well, I hope not, but I would point out that people say it was a terrible mistake now to have gone into Libya. I would point out that Muammar Gaddafi was at the gates of Benghazi with his tanks and artillery and was about to slaughter untold thousands of citizens of Benghazi. So I'd like to put that to rest as to whether we should have intervened or not. I don't think that we had much choice if we wanted to prevent that mass slaughter. We didn't initiate this uprising against Gaddafi. It was part of the Arab Spring. Well, again, I don't mean to be so critical, but the fact is that we laid out a blueprint. Lindsey Graham and Joe Lieberman and I, we wrote about it, we urged about it, we spoke about it, of the things we had to do for Libya. We had to help them secure their borders. We had to secure the caches of weapons. We had to get all of our NGOs in there to help them build the civil society. There's a blueprint for what we needed to do, and instead, we just walked away. And now we're seeing this deterioration exactly as you described. And I am deeply concerned, deeply concerned. I don't know how we could intervene militarily if we were considering it, but there's no doubt that radical Islam is on the increase, and the representative government, or whatever it is almost, well, as you know, they're in the far eastern part of the country. So it's a very, very difficult situation, and I think it's going to become more difficult. And unfortunately, I think we may start paying close attention if the oil supply from Libya gets disrupted, because that's a major portion of the world's supply. It's a great tragedy. It's a terrible tragedy.
There was a question all the way on the back on the right. Please stand. Thank you.
I would like to pick up on what Senator McCain was saying at the beginning about arms to Ukraine. You know, I think that I'm just apologetic of food not bombs type policy. And I think that US actually exercising its superpower status all the time with the military means rather than economical means. And we see the examples in history, and in the most recent history, when US was very much successful by doing economy rather military-based approach. For example, Marshall's Plan for Germany. And my point is, why don't you think that by making Ukraine ability to make money, to make them economically more sustainable, that they would buy all the weapons that they would actually need to protect themselves? And at the end of the day, the real weapon of Russia is not Russian army, it is Russian gas. And as you know, Ukraine and Poland is the most potential promising areas of shale gas production. And the companies which can actually help Ukraine and Poland to become energy independent, and the whole Europe to become energy independent, are in your constituency, Senator. In Arizona, or in Senator Cruz's constituency in Texas, or in Wyoming. We have only Pennsylvania here missing. You have the controlling stake here, and you can pursue your companies to go there. Why not focus on that?
I think you've answered the second question already, but as to the first, what should the United States be doing in terms of economic diplomacy to help new friends like Ukraine, given, especially in the case of Ukraine, that we're talking about one of the most corrupt countries in the world?
Well, you know, just quickly, I mean, you've put your finger on a number of the things that should be done, and Senator McCain and I are in agreement, probably all of us here are. Using U.S. energy resources, but also energy expertise to assist Ukraine and other nations develop their own energy, find new energy partners. I mean, I think Algeria wants to build another pipeline to develop more and put more energy into Europe. We should be helping them if they could help move European nations away from Russian energy. We should use our expertise and we should use our resources to help these nations wean themselves away from this overdependence. And then we should also use our economic and diplomatic power to help the Ukrainian economy do what it wants to do already, which is integrate more and more into the European economy. That's the way they want to go. They're threatened because of this energy resource. And finally, we need to, and we were talking about this earlier with officials from Canada who have been good allies on this, continue to look at ways to up the sanctions pressure against Russia. And I think nothing better than more sanctions in the energy sector. Sanction them in the space where that they're using as their club. We have trouble with getting European nations fully on board with sanctions. We may have to do some just North American-based sanctions and then hopefully get more European nations on board. Those are some of the things that I would do. I think we're together on the military side.
The gentleman.
Well, could I just make one brief comment? My friend, it's very difficult for the Ukrainians to purchase weapons or anything else while their country is being dismembered, and the industrial strength of Ukraine lies in the east, where Vladimir Putin is now sending in his separatists. Remember, in Crimea, they just bought uniforms from local stores. It wasn't Russians. And you can't make this stuff up. But so they're in a war, and it's very difficult for them to have economic development when their assets and their efforts and their economy, to a large degree, is at risk with the continued Russian encroachment into their invasion into their country. So the IMF wants to help them. Other European countries want to help them. We want to help them. But this was a total corrupt kleptocracy under Yanukovych, and they're going to have to make a lot of fundamental changes in the way that they do business through their legislative body in order to really bring about an economic recovery, and it's going to take a lot of assistance.
Okay, right here, please.
Thank you. I'm Cesar Jaramillo with Project Plowshares here in Canada. I have a question for both Senator McCain and Senator Kaine. And I wonder if I could get your views on the relationship between the continued possession of nuclear weapons and America's claim to exceptional superpower status. At the beginning of the panel, Senator McCain, you said that the Cold War was over, and during the Cold War there was a constant threat of a nuclear exchange or a nuclear attack. That is more than a quarter of a century after that, there are still thousands of nuclear weapons in existence. As 9/11 showed us, which Mr. McCain mentioned in the previous panel, the country that has one of the two greatest nuclear arsenals in the world, the arsenal itself was useless either to deter and to react to attacks from non-state actors. So again, what do you think is the role of nuclear weapons in the 21st century when the nature of the threats have changed, and when, as President Obama said in 2009 in Prague, we should start thinking about a world without nuclear weapons?
The nuclear weapons are still valuable from a deterrent standpoint. The nuclear arsenal is an aging arsenal, and that creates some of its own challenges, even for nations with significant resources like the United States. But the arsenal still has its value as a deterrent. But certainly, the U.S. activity to engage with other nations around the NPT, around agreements like 123 agreements on civilian nuclear deals. It's important that we play a global leadership role to try to minimize the potential for any negative use of nuclear technology. That's what makes the stakes so high in these discussions that we're all following with Iran. Our goal should be to minimize the risk of any nuclear intentional or unintentional use.
Senator McCain, do you agree with the idea of getting down to zero if we can?
I don't believe in getting down to zero, but I do believe that we could have further reductions. But right now, given the tensions between ourselves and Russia and some of their behavior, including breaking violation on the development of low cruise missiles, I think it's not the right time to do it. I'd also like to just point out that if we make a deal with Iran, which I'm afraid in our frenzy to try to get some kind of agreement, and the countries in the region believe that it is a path for Iranian acquisition and development of nuclear weapons, you're going to see nuclear weapons spread throughout the entire Middle East. And that will put a whole new cast on this whole issue of nuclear proliferation. And I have talked to leaders of some countries in the Middle East who believe that they have to be prepared to acquire a nuclear inventory because they believe it's a matter of time before Iran does.
The lady in red, third row. Please stand up.
Ala Murabit, Libya. I actually wanted to touch base just on that specifically. I would like your thoughts on what you feel about the impression that the American government has been extremely indecisive in Middle Eastern politics and the situation in the Middle East in the past few years. And it's actually led to a much stronger involvement a much stronger involvement of the local, of the regional governments. And for example, from my own country, Libya, we have a very clear military involvement of countries on opposing sides, and the influence that plays into regional security, and the fact that there's a genuine belief that had the international community been more proactive in Syria, for example, ISIS would not be in the position that it's in. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, you certainly see indecision. You certainly see some starts and stops. The encouragement of an Arab Spring, and then a step back and, well, wait a minute, it may not work out quite the way we want. Although, let's be honest, there are some examples that we don't talk enough about of countries who, in the Arab Spring, there's some real positive steps. Tunisia just had parliamentary elections, presidential elections next month, and could really be an example of an Arab Spring example that could be a very positive one, both for that country and for others. You know, I probably have some different views, and I know I do, than Senator McCain about, you know, if the president laid out some red lines and then backed away from them. I actually don't think of the Syrian chemical weapon one as a mistake. But I do think of some of the statements that the administration made about this or that leader must go. Those are the kinds of red lines that I don't think we should set. And I think in those instances, there were some mistakes, and we sent signals to people and raised their expectations that then we weren't able or willing to follow through on, and that is a problem. So no, there has been indecision about policy in the Middle East, and I think that is being exacerbated to some degree as I travel to the Middle East. There is a grave concern that American energy independence, that makes us less dependent upon the Middle East, that is in itself a form of disengagement that makes folks in the Middle East worried about. It's one that we are excited about. We're excited to be less dependent on Middle Eastern energy. It increases anxiety in the region, but that's not our fault. We want to have a domestic energy economy and be more self-reliant in that way. But no, I'll acknowledge the perception of indecision has its basis in some, you know, different starts and twists and turns that seemed mystifying.
We have about 15 more minutes to keep the senators in the hot seat. So I'm going to start grouping questions, and I'm going to plead with you to keep them relatively short so we can get as many as possible. The lady in glasses in the fourth row.
On Syria, first, my name is Renda Slim. I'm with the Middle East Institute. On Syria, in fact, there have been 2 red lines on Syria, I agree, you know, and both of them have not been enforced. And I agree with Senator McCain that this has sent a bad impression, image, perception of the United States in the Middle East. Now, going forward, what should we expect in 2015 from the US Congress in terms of the debate about Syria? There are many ideas that are now out there in the public arena about how we should move forward. There's, of course, the US administration TRAPE and EQUIP program. There is the Turkish government idea of establishing a safe zone, you know. There is now the UN envoy idea of freeze zones, at least in the interim. So I would like if you can help us understand where do you see the debate in the US Congress moving forward next years about Syria. Thank you.
The gentleman there. Thank you. And please do keep your questions short.
Thank you. Giga Bokharia from Georgia. It's the country which is part of the same geopolitical confrontation, what happens in Ukraine, and the country which is part of the corridor of alternative energy for Europe, by the way. My Russian colleague mentioned the Marshall Fund. If I'm not mistaken, Marshall Fund was made possible because Nazi regime was militarily confronted and defeated, only because of that. So my question is about the weapons for Ukraine again. For the senators, do you think this issue is closed for administration? Where is the issue? Is there a chance that for that to be revisited or not? Thank you.
Thank you. And our mayor from Venezuela.
David Smolansky, mayor of El Hatillo, Caracas, Venezuela. I would like to talk about Latin America that has not been mentioned in Halifax. Venezuelan whole government is a threat to the region, protecting terrorists, using its oil-rich income to export its system, and it has opened the doors of the region to Syria, Russia, Belarus, and right now there's no democracy. So what can be done? Which role will the new majority of the Congress will play in this situation? And is it possible to see a more aggressive role from the U.S. and especially their allies on the situation in Venezuela? Thank you very much.
So, Congressman, what is Congress going to do about Syria, Ukraine, and Venezuela?
I'm just going to be a minority party member, so I'm going to wait to see. No, how about if I let Senator McCain tackle it first, and I have some thoughts too.
Well, first of all, we need to have hearings and debate and amendments, legislation and amendments, which is something, as we all know, we've not had for the past several years, and there's a lot of us on both sides of the aisle that regret that because we haven't given the American people the benefit of our debates and informing them. One of the great things about an open process is that people are able to gain information and knowledge and help them decide what's best for the country. So on Syria, I know this, that unless we have a no-fly zone, unless we provide serious assistance to what's left of the Free Syrian Army, unless we do not, unless we bomb Bashar Assad in the same way that we are ISIS, then we will be committing crimes against humanity. Right now, we are bombing ISIS in Syria while Bashar Assad is barrel bombing the Free Syrian Army. That's not moral. We're going to take 5,000 young Syrians to start with into Saudi Arabia and train them and tell them to go back into Syria to be barrel bombed by Bashar Assad. We have to have a viable Free Syrian Army, otherwise we're faced with the Hobson's choice of Bashar Assad or ISIS, which is a horrible choice to make. And we're going to have to make, as I said, this no-fly zone, and we will have to train up in a much more rapid fashion than we have planned as we are looking at the number of people who are fighting in Syria. Seminal moment was when we decide not to, in my view, carry out our the response to crossing the, quote, red line. I get that from everybody in the Middle East. But another red line that was so important was the day the Iranians decided that Hezbollah would come into the fight, the day that they stepped up their arming and equipping, when the Iranian Revolutionary Guard came in and was fighting actually and training Bashar Assad. It was the President of the United States that said it's not a matter of whether Bashar Assad leaves, it's a matter of when. And at that moment, we should have realized that Bashar Assad was going to shift the momentum on his side. So if we don't do those things, we are going to see a continued slaughter of innocent men, women, and children in the most horrible fashion, which are these barrel bombs, which are indiscriminate in their killing. Over 200,000 people have been killed. 150,000 are in his prisons, and 3.5 million are refugees. I'll never forget being in a refugee camp in Jordan, and we're driving around. A teacher showed me there was only 150,000 in that camp, and she said, "See these young children?" I said, "Yes." She said, "They believe you've abandoned them, and they're going to take revenge on you, Senator McCain." And I believed her. We are sowing the wind.
But Senator, the question was about what Congress is going to do about it. So.
We got to have the debate. We got to try, people like me have got to try to convince our colleagues. And if we don't, then we will be responsible also. Right now, I hold the president largely responsible because the Congress has not played a role. If we can't convince them, the British Parliament was unable to convince were unable to be convinced in the 1930s. We won't go to a country where they don't speak our language that we don't know who they are. I'll do the best I can.
And let me offer some thoughts about what Congress will do on Syria and then Venezuela. With respect to Syria, I do think the president made a mistake by setting a red line by saying Bashar al-Assad must go. Now, Senator McCain and I actually agree on much of what should be done in Syria, but a point of disagreement that we have is I don't think regime change should be an official American policy. Bashar al-Assad's a war criminal. We need to take steps against him for his humanitarian violations, A, B, C, D, and E. But I do not think the regime change of another nation should be American foreign policy. It just should not be. Now, what do we do with respect to Syria as we craft an authorization? The president laid out a mission that includes Syria, the arming, training, and equipping of folks fighting ISIL in Syria, as well as airstrike campaign in Syria. However, the thing that's going to get a little bit difficult about it is Syria has not declared war on the United States. ISIL has. Baghdadi has. And so for purposes of crafting an authorization for use of military force, you know, there are compelling needs to do things in Syria, but we're dealing with a horrible regime that is violating all these humanitarian norms, that has not declared war in the United States, and a jihadist movement that's doing horrible things that has declared war in the United States. And so there's going to be some separation probably in terms of what we do. With respect to Venezuela, big picture, I have a hope about what Congress will do, and here's what it is. The United States has a foreign policy that since the beginning of our nation, it's worked on an east-west axis around the world. We've been worried about Europe. We're worried about the Soviet Union. Worried about rising power, now we're going to pivot to Asia. When we've had a consistent foreign policy with respect to a north-south, it's tended to be about Europe, the Monroe Doctrine. Hey, European nations, don't get involved in Latin America. We don't really have a north-south axis to our foreign policy, except around times of crisis. Undocumented kids coming to the border, boy, we got to really be concerned about Central America now. The numbers drop, okay, we're not so concerned. But the funny thing about not having a north-south axis foreign policy is, look at the facts on the ground. Who's our #1 trade partner? Canada. Who's our #2 trade partner? Mexico. The economic reality works on a north-south axis. How about who our population is? Where are people traveling to get to the United States from? What's the ethnic origins of people who live in the United States? Increasingly, it's a north-south axis. We need a president, and we haven't had one, probably since Kennedy laid out the notion of the Alliance for the Americas, and then LBJ didn't pick it up after Kennedy was assassinated. We haven't had a president who has really tried to make a north-south axis, a real true America's strategy that has been more than an episodic concern about this issue or that issue. Venezuela is one of these issues where together, if we really focused on a north-south axis to our foreign policy, we could bring tremendous pressure to bear. And this dictatorial government, they're trying every desperate play in the book to hold on to power, but it's slipping between their fingers fast so they can hold on to it. But we can work with nations in the region to give hope and to give spirit to the opposition within Venezuela, and that's what we ought to be doing.
Okay, we're into...
Could I just finally say, if we're not going to protect the Free Syrian Army, then please, in God's name, don't send them into certain death. That is really immoral. If we do that, I mean, if you don't want to, if you want to leave Assad in power, and fine, but don't send Free Syrian Army people in to die whose object is to overthrow the guy. Then finally on Georgia, if I could just say, some events have taken place recently. They're very disturbing. Firing of the foreign minister, obviously an agreement about Abkhazia, which is deeply disturbing. But that's the message that's being sent throughout Eastern Europe. Look at what's happening in Hungary. Look what even the Czech president said, comments the other day, sort of apologizing for Putin. Look, these things all have consequences. And they are accommodating, as we see our failure to help the people in Ukraine. Other nations in the region are beginning to accommodate and look to how they'll conduct themselves without the umbrella and assistance of the United States of America.
Thank you. We have less than 5 minutes, so I want to take some very, very quick questions and then let the senators close things up. Please, here on the aisle.
Jerry Brownlee, Minister of Defence from New Zealand. Firstly, acknowledge the great work the United States does in trying to protect a free world. It's been extraordinary for many, many years, and we're grateful for that. With ISIL, this is a stateless organisation, but is apparently well organised and very well resourced. Do you have any thoughts on how that resource might be cut off so that the supply they have for paying people who've got otherwise little opportunities in their lives to be part of their forces and also to equip themselves with weapons is significantly, if not completely, dried off?
Thank you. Steve Clemens, quickly.
To restore strategic clarity in the world so that enemies get the signal and allies have confidence in what we're doing, the United States needs to indicate what kinds of things it's going to care most about to restore strategic order. And that requires also deciding what things it's not going to get drawn into. And just listening to this conversation today, we're very much in a whack-a-mole discussion. Which problem aren't we chasing that you would cut out if you had the opportunity to restore strategic order? So this is the question of what we shouldn't be doing as opposed to what we are engaged in today.
Thank you. And finally, Alyssa Ayres. Right here. No, excuse me.
I will be fast. Hi, Alyssa Ayres from the Council on Foreign Relations, so from the United States. Could I ask both senators to reflect a little bit on Afghanistan? Here is an involvement where we have, in many ways, exhibited exemplary diplomacy. We've had a great military coalition. We've had a partnership with NATO, ISAF, and yet our outcomes still, I think, aren't what the international community would have hoped for. What should we do next? And does that show sort of the limits of international engagement?
Okay, so in 5 seconds or less, closing comments, trying to wrap in ISIL and cutting off its resources, priorities, what to exclude, what to focus on.
I'll do 2 out of 3. So on Afghanistan, look, outcomes aren't what people would hope. Again, the life expectancy of an Afghan in 2001 was 44 years old. It's 61 years now. Now, there are 30 million Afghans. 30 million times 17 years equals 510 million extra years of human life. That's a good outcome. That's a good outcome. Number of kids in schools, that's a good outcome. But I am concerned, we took our eye off the ball in Afghanistan to put it in Iraq, at least a couple of times since '02, and did it in a way that took resources and attention away from Afghanistan. And just like John said earlier, I'm very worried, while I'm all about going against ISIL, I'm very worried about that we're going to do the same thing again. We have got to make the commitment to Afghanistan one that folks know that they can count on so that we can protect the gains that have been won. With respect to what are we doing that we shouldn't, again, I would not remove the criticism, the harsh criticism, seeking sanctions against horrible dictators from our toolbox, but I would remove presidents saying that Mubarak must go or Assad must go. I don't think the regime change in another nation should be the official policy of the United States. If you don't, here's the way to do it. Maliki asked for our help, finally. You know, after he ran the place into the ground, he asked for our help. We didn't come out and boast to the world, Maliki must go. What we said was, well, you want our help. We got some conditions. There's got to be an inclusive government. You got to have Sunni, Shias, and Kurds represented. You got to do this, you got to do that. All those conditions meant that Maliki went. If you want our help, we got conditions for help, but we don't make regime change an official policy in the United States. I think we've learned that that is the wrong way to go.
Closing thought.
On Afghanistan, very quickly, we've got to have a sustaining force behind. I was in a meeting with a Pakistan general just the day before yesterday. I said, can they survive without a residual United States force? He said, no. And that is the consensus. So we have to leave not a combat force behind per se, but a sustaining force. They don't have intelligence, they don't have medevac, they don't have a whole lot of things that they need to have. My friend, when Ronald Reagan came to the presidency in 1981, he didn't tell American people what we won't do and where we won't go. What he did was he told the American people peace through strength, and we had a certain set of fundamentals for which applied everywhere in the world. And in the words of Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan won the Cold War without firing a shot. One of the things that I dislike about this president, he keeps telling our enemies what we won't do. And so I believe that, first of all, we need to have fundamental principles about our support for freedom and democracy, and it doesn't mean militarily always, it means a whole lot of other ways. And then we have to look at every crisis through that prism. And that means that American power, soft, diplomatic, economic, and yes, military, is still the indispensable factor in the world and will remain so for generations to come. And somehow we seem to have lost our way there. There is a recognition, there must be a recognition of America as the indispensable nation, and everything flows from there.
Gentlemen, on behalf of the 40-some nations represented here at Halifax,
there were 60 before we told jokes last night. There were 40 immediately thereafter.
And on behalf of the 140 that aren't represented, let me ask and exhort you to bring this spirit of bipartisanship back to Washington and back into Congress. The whole world is counting on you. Thank you very much.
That was good.
Thank you all very much.
I like that.